Just some quick background. Like last time we discussed, I thought we would just restart from where we left off last time. But we did a very short portion last time, right? It was a very informal discussion that we had on Judges chapter 17. And last time I was telling you that from 17 onwards starts the next and the concluding part of the Judges, the book. And from 17, we begin to see the effect of repeated cycles of apostasy. And the interesting thing we would observe from 17 is that Israel is now not dealing with external oppression, but the enemy is within them now. It's themselves. They are the enemy. So what we would see is increased conflicts between people, conflicts between the tribes. We already had hints of that with Samson, right? And from 17 onwards, it's all inter-tribe conflict. And there is an acceleration on the cry for a king because they think that that's a solution. And with 17 and 18 are two chapters that go together. We'll study about a person named Micah and what he does and the impact that it has, the long-term impact that it has on Israel as a nation itself. How something that manifests itself in one family slowly spreads and infects an entire tribe. And then it has such a long-lasting effect that it stays for a very long time. And this person's name Micah, and Micah, interestingly, is rarely spoken about or heard of. And last time we studied the first 6 verses of this chapter, and we studied about Micah. The Bible doesn't identify which tribe he is from, but it tells us that he lived in the territory of Ephraim. Now, what is special about this territory of Ephraim? One thing to note is, if you take a quick look at the map of Israel, so roughly here is where, can you see my arrow? Or the place that's marked as Kiryat Jearim and Shiloh. It's around this area, these 2 arrows, that Micah lived. The interesting thing to note is this place called Shiloh. Shiloh is interesting because this is where the tabernacle of the Lord was at that time. And if we remember Deuteronomy, we will remember that God had his instruction that once they were in the promised land, they could not worship wherever they wanted to, or rather they could not offer their sacrifices wherever they wanted to. And he would identify the place where the tabernacle had to be installed. And at this point in time, it's at Shiloh. And it's also good to recollect from starting from Exodus, the appointment of Aaron's family as the priests for Israel, and also some of the design that God had put in place for the vestment of the priest. One important part of the vestment was an ephod, which is something that the priest would wear to cover his upper body. And one important part of the ephod was a breastplate that he would wear on top of the garment. And the breastplate had 2 things called the Urim, or is it I keep mispronouncing this, the Urim and the Thummim. And these, I do not know exactly what it is, and I could not identify it. Some people say it's 2 pieces of wood, some say it's 2 stones. But the net effect is the combination of the ephod and the Urim and the Thummim would be a way for the chief priest to take a decision on contentious matters, on anything that needed God's intervention to make a decision on. And through the combination of the breastpiece, the Urim and the Thummim, the chief priest had a way to ascertain what was God's decision and what was God's desire in a particular situation. So this is the context, the situation which we have to place Micah and the events of these 2 chapters as they unfold. The other thing to remember is also some of the very clear commandments that the Lord had given Israel. Among them are the 10 commandments, where the first 2 commandments spoke explicitly about God and saying that there shall be no other God but me. And then the commandment that you should not make a graven image of anything and worship it, right? Anything above the sky or on the earth or below the sea, and worship it. So that's a context in which, and these are fundamental commandments that we could expect every Israelite to be aware of, that they wouldn't have forgotten. And in Deuteronomy, we saw how Deuteronomy ends with Moses giving them instructions of a set of blessings and curses. So the Lord had this set of commandments. He had this contract with Israel when they enter the promised land, how they should go about their mission, because they were a watched nation, they were a model nation. And along with the set of commandments, a set of the rules for model code of conduct that Israel had, was a series of blessings and a series of curses. Curses when they violated this model code of conduct, and blessings when they followed it. And when they entered the promised land, we saw in Joshua how they, true to Moses' command on these two mountains, they had to stand, half the tribe on Mount Ebal and half the tribe on the other mountain, and they had to pronounce these blessings and cursings. And the first curse that they had to pronounce was that anybody who would make a molten image would give money to a craftsman to make a molten image and then install this image in a secret place would be cursed. So this is a set of the readings in the Bible prior to our portion, which will set the context for today's lesson. Okay. So I also spoke, so that's a theological context in which we actually set today's lesson. I also spoke about how the timeline, right? It is set in the period from 1100 BC to 1050 BC. So remember that you're counting downwards, right? Uh, the year of the Lord is 0, and times before the year of the Lord, before Jesus' birth, is counted minus. So the first year before Jesus' birth would be year 1. So 1100 to 1050 is the progression of time, and it's the same time where, and Judges is talking about events that are happening in different places at the same time. Though in our book it is arranged chapter by chapter, the book follows a thematic pattern. It follows the theme of how the spiritual journey of Israel is taking place. So the author is more concerned with that chronology than with the time-based chronology. So we'll Samson episode, the Micah episode, and even first chapter of Samuel, a lot of Eli and Samuel and Saul's time, is all happening at the same time, roughly, at different places in Israel at this time. Okay. Today's study will not focus on this last portion, which was comparing the 3 sons and mothers, Samson and his mother, Micah and his mother, Samuel and his mother. This will make an interesting study, but we have a lot to cover today, so I'm just skipping that so that we can do a study of the specific scripture portion itself. A quick aerial view of today's portion. Chapter 17 is a very short chapter. It starts with this very rich person, Micah's mother, who has lost 700 shekels of silver, and she pronounces a curse on anybody who has stolen it. Micah, hearing the curse, gets terrified and comes and surrenders it back because he has taken it. And nowhere does it mention the word that he has stolen it, though it explicitly that's what it means. But his mother now tries to convert the blessing into a curse into a blessing. And she does that by putting aside that money for the Lord. And she orders that 200 pieces of shekels of silver should be used to build an image, an idol, and that it should be installed in a shrine in Micah's house. And that's as far as we got last time. And the concluding verse of last time was a very important verse, because it's on this verse that everything in these 2 chapters anchors. And that verse is, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. We will dig deep into this verse. What does it mean to say Israel had no king in today's study? So as we move further into the rest of 17, we will see how a young Levite, remember the Levites were a set apart tribe. The family of Aaron were the priestly family. The priests came from Aaron's family. The other Levites, based on their tribe, were given specific duties associated with the tabernacle. Worship at the tabernacle, how the tabernacle would be set up, how it would be torn down when they had to shift it, and how it would be carried. So different tribes had different responsibilities. There is a little bit of suspense on who this young Levite is, but the last portion of 18 tells us that it was actually Moses' direct descendant. He was a descendant of his son Gershom. Okay, so that is like a big revelation and very significant. Then we see that this young Levite comes to Micah. Micah actually asks him to be his priest in this shrine where he has installed the temple, and the Levite agrees. And in chapter 18, we see how the tribe of Dan is now very discontent with the place that has been allotted to them. We will look at why they are discontent later, and they decide to find a new place to settle down. And to do that, they send out some scouts, some spies, to go and figure out and see if there's a good place that they could, without much hassle, actually conquer and take over. And these spies they come to where Micah was, and they meet the priest, the Levite, and they have an encounter with him. And we will study a little bit about that encounter. Um, One thing that happens is that they notice the idols and the ephod. So once they leave Micah's place, go and find this place that they want to settle down in. They go back to their tribe and tell them, we have found this ideal place. Let's go and attack it. It's easy to grab. And they all set out. A large number of Danites set out to go and conquer this place. And they once more go via Micah's place. And we see how they actually now steal not just the gods that Micah make, but they also steal the priest himself. And then that leads to an encounter between the Danites and Micah. Micah's everything is gone. He has this huge money invested in his gods. He has his future invested in this god, and it's all gone. And we see from that encounter, they move on, they go and conquer this place called Laish, and it all seems to end very nicely because they seem to have settled down there, and they even set up their copy of the tabernacle. Not explicitly mentioned as a tabernacle, but they set up a place to worship, which is in direct conflict with the order that God had given them, that the one place to worship would be a place that God would choose. Okay, so uh, the big context is for Micah. Throughout these two chapters, we see for Micah, his mother, his neighbors, the young Levite, and the entire tribe of Dan, the Danites, the covenant relationship with their God had lost all significance. Okay? Of inheritance that was apportioned to them by Joshua. And they're not happy with you, and they migrate all this long distance up to the north. And it's not all the Danites who migrate, it's only some of them. And they settle down in this place called Laish. And there's a place called Sidon here, which has a certain significance. So that is a quite some distance from Laish. It's on the coast. Okay? And this is the geographic setting for our study today. Having looked at that, let's move into our first question. We already discussed this last time, so we will not get into the details, but let's just explore when Judges 17:6 says, in those days, Israel had no king. And this is repeated again in the beginning of chapter 18:1. We know that when an author emphasizes and repeats a phrase, it has special significance for that portion. Why does the author use the statement? He's in fact using it as a statement which is a summary explanation of the behavior of Micah and the tribe of Dan and the Levite as captured in these two chapters. Why do you think the author thinks in those days Israel had no king explains what is being described in these two chapters? So the first question, just to reestablish the context, in Exodus 19:6 and 8, uh, God speaks to Moses and Moses speaks to the people in turn. God tells Moses why he drew Israel out of Egypt. He told Moses that you shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And all the people together answered, all that the Lord commanded we do. So what's happening here? One is God was establishing himself as their king. If they were a kingdom, he was their king. And Israel covenants that they will accept his kingship. Okay? Now God, Israel's king, was to be their objective source of truth. So we will look at the question of what does it mean to have an objective truth as well as a subjective version of truth, and the hazards of the strength of one and the hazards of the other. The second piece of context is this verse itself. In those days, Israel had no king. So when you take it in the light of the earlier verse, we will know that the objective source of truth was no longer visible or not so strongly anchored in their life, in their minds, in their heart. And why did that happen? So Judges uses this phrase to say Israel had violated their covenant relationship with God, and now they no longer recognize God as their king. So they had reached a state where they had no recognition or submission to God as their king, right? And therefore, with that, all objective basis for truth is lost. All truth is subjective now for them. What is the outworking of that? The consequences are Micah makes idols for her son. Micah's mother, that should be, makes idols for her son, installs them in her shrine. She sees nothing wrong in that. God is the one who appointed who should be his priest, from which family they should come, and the duties of the Levitical tribes. Micah usurps this authority, and he sees nothing wrong in that. The Levite, who should have been more aware of God's commands, his tribe's role, sees no problem with accepting the role of a priest. The Danites do not want to take the land they were given, but they will take the land that they want. We will see that here they were called lethargic. They had just kind of settled in, they wanted an easy life. And they were searching for a place where they could actually grab and have an easy life without too much of effort. Remember, none of the conquests, when Israel was asked to enter the Canaan and take over Canaan, God fought with them. And they were supposed to fight with each other, knowing that God is on their side. And that would be the basis for them to inherit, to possess the land. And we are living in the spirit of this possess the land part of that commandment, occupation of Canaan. We see how later in this chapter, we see how the Danites seek a divination. So it's not that they have forgotten all about their tradition, their customs, their commandments, and the context in which they are in this promised land. They know that the ephod, was something through which the priests could actually divine God's decision on certain matters. And seeing Micah's ephod, they think that we can use this as a way to understand what is God's will. So they seek God's will using a fake copy of the ephod, and they see nothing wrong in that. The Levite sees nothing wrong in obliging them and trying to find out or give them what they want. We see the Levite who violated God's role for his life sees nothing wrong in abandoning Micah for a larger congregation, right? For a bigger position, in a more wealthy position. We see how the Danites see nothing wrong in stealing from their own brethren, from Micah. We see how the Danites see nothing wrong in threatening Micah and his neighbors with bodily harm. When Micah chases them down and tries to get back his gods and his priests, they see nothing wrong in threatening him and saying, "Get off. You will come to a great bodily harm if you keep chasing us. So you have lost your thing, forget it. Be content with that. Go and live the way you can." We see the Danites have no problems with slaughtering an undisturbed and unsuspecting people at Laish. Many times they're described as undisturbed and unsuspecting. So clearly the author is expressing his anguish at what the Danites were doing. This is not something that God had wanted them to do. Okay, and they see nothing wrong in that. And the Danites publicly established an alternative place of worship. The tabernacle was at Shiloh. There was a commandment that would be the place that God will choose, right? Where the tabernacle is installed, which would be the focus of their worship. And they installed the stolen idols that they stole from Micah, as well as the stolen priest, and appoint their own priestly order, because they decide that Gershom's family would be and his descendants would be their priests forever. And they see nothing wrong in that. So we see that with the objective source of their truth, God was no longer in sight. They no longer recognized that as their source of truth. Now it is all subjective. It is relative to what they feel is right in their eyes. They did whatever they wanted. So those two places where this phrase appears, I'll just read it. In 17:6, after we read about Micah's mother making the idol for him, the author tells us that um, now this, okay, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. So a lot of what we looked at now explains what they did, what they saw fit. Okay. And when it comes to chapter 18, verse 1, it says, in those days, Israel had no quick king, and quickly follows up with, in those days, the tribe of East Dan was seeking a place of their own where they might settle. Now, this, again, they're doing what they see fit. Their king had told them that this is the place where you're to settle, and you had to work out your possession. But they see nothing wrong, and clearly they have disregarded their covenant relationship, and they don't regard God as their king, and they see nothing wrong in moving away from here. Okay, so let's move to the next question, which is Micah's do-it-yourself religion. Okay, Micah, by his own wisdom, was trying to be sincere in his worship. The Levite from Bethlehem was agreeing to engage in a duty that Micah thought the Levites were set apart for. Do you think Micah or the Levite were being deliberately insincere in their religion? Is it possible to be totally sincere but still wrong? So there is nothing explicitly in the text that tells us that Micah was setting it up, the shrine and all of that he was insincere. He was very sincerely doing. And he was setting up, he knew that there had to be a priest, it had to be a Levite from the tribe of Levi. So, and the Levite also feels that he is someone who's associated with the worship of the Lord. So if you look at it in a very liberal perspective, perhaps they were being very sincere, a bit misguided. Is it possible to be sincere, misguided, but still very, very wrong is the question that we have to look at. So the question, I think, we can conclude from what you all said is that it is possible. Micah was probably very sincere, even if his motivations were material, because we saw, in verse 13, he says, now I know the Lord, after he installs a Levite as his priest, now I know the Lord will make me rich or prosperous because I have this Levite as my priest, right? The Levite, we tend to think, reading this chapter, was probably less sincere than Micah was, right? One is, like Santosh pointed out, and like Blessy also pointed out, he said, the question is, why was he wandering in cities that were not part of the allocation of the Levites? One more question is, when we look at the role of the Levites, right, and the various tribes, you'll notice that most of them begin service at 30. And 30 is not someone you would call young Levite, right? So even he is violating his set duties and the age at which he should be entering into tabernacle duties, into priestly duties, okay? I'm sure he knew this, at least we can well. He did not hesitate to make a fake divination, right? So the ephod, clearly it was a fake ephod. God would not have spoken through him through this ephod. So, but yet he has given a statement to the Danites when they asked for it, and that was clearly fake. So he did not hesitate to make a fake divination. He is someone who was happy telling you what you wanted to hear, right? He could sense the way the wind was blowing and he would move in that direction. We also see that he had no hesitation betraying Micah's trust. So we could say that Micah probably comes across as more sincere, though misguided. The Levite was probably less sincere because we expect him to be better guided, right? The question, is it possible to be sincere but wrong? I think it is very, very possible, especially when your frame of reference is wrong. And that is what the author kept emphasizing for us, right? In those days, they did not recognize God as their king. And so their frame of reference had gone away.
So Sushil, just one point quickly. Why is that, Micah has literally gone away from the teachings of the God? Because, I think there was a period where there weren't preachers or there weren't priests to basically guide people like Micah. So Micah was completely misguided down the generations. Is that a fair thing to look at and understand?
We could make that assumption, though I would say I don't know. We know that he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in Bethlehem. He came from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is not one of the allocated cities for the Levites. So he was wandering. Probably Going by how easily he was tempted, I think your assumption may be true, that he was looking for more than, or was it Santosh who said that, more than he could get elsewhere. Probably not enough recognition. Probably he was very eager to start doing stuff, and the tradition told him that he could not start working, assuming duties, until he was 30. It could be a set of circumstances, right? So we don't know really. It could be true. It could be any of those. But we know that he was very likely, he knew that he was in the wrong. And even the community that he was in earlier, the Danites, seemed to know that he was wrong, because those three questions he asked him is very interesting. We'll be looking at that later. Okay. So coming back to this question, sincere but very wrong. Just want to share the story of something called the cargo cult. I don't know whether you've all heard of this. See, during the Second World War, the Allied army had set up bases in many small islands around the world, especially around Australia and some of the regions in the ocean. And they would set up air bases because they would want supplies to come in there, and that would be a place from which they could launch an attack to get closer to the enemy, because the range that the aircraft could go in all was not very high. So they set up these airstrips in some of these islands, and these islands were, prior to that, inhabited only by the tribals who lived there, who were not very well educated, not very aware, right? So these tribals, what do they see? They see these planes coming in and landing, and these planes would bring in supplies for the people, for the army that was stationed there, and they would share. They would actually, to get some local produce or to get help from the natives, they would share this produce, probably Coke and burgers and pizza. I'm just joking, but I don't know what stuff that the natives clearly saw as good stuff that they couldn't get in their land, natural environment, they would get. And what is the connections they made? The plane lands and this good stuff comes. One of these, there are many cargo cults, this pattern where they begin to believe that it's this plane that brings it for them, and the people who come in the plane turns into a worship where they begin to worship these. And this is real. I'm telling you, narrating things that happen. And some of these tribes exist even today. So they would, for example, one of the cargo cults is called John Frum, because whenever this American soldier gets on, he'll say, I'm John from New York, John from San Francisco. So it becomes John Frum is their god, who would bring all these goodies for them. And then after the war, these bases were dismantled. The planes stopped coming, and the natives were still waiting. So in their frame of reference, very sincerely, they believed that this thing from the sky would come down, and this man would come down and they would get this good stuff. And how would the planes come down? They knew there was this control tower, and there was this guy sitting with these big earphones, like the earphones I'm wearing on his head, and he would talk on them, and there is someone who would show directions on the runway, and then the plane would land. So these people set that up as a religious rituals, hoping that these planes would land. These are some pictures of one of the tribes. You see, they make a model of the plane, and you see this guy here imitating. He's got this headphone and these aerials sticking out. They've even made an elaborate model of the radar and stuff like that. And this is true. These people exist, okay? And they're waiting. They're very sincere, but totally misguided, because they have not understood what exactly was their what was happening there. They do not understand what was happening. So in all sincerity, they're doing something, but they're totally misguided. They're totally wrong. No plane is going to land because of this, right? They're not. John Frum is not going to get them Coke any longer. Not with this worship, right? So I thought this was a beautiful illustration of exactly what it meant for people to be very sincere. It's an extreme example, but totally misguided, right? So sincerity is not a hallmark of whether you're right or wrong. It's your frame of reference. With that, we move to the third question. What do you think of the first encounter between the Danite spies and the young Levite? Why did they ask him to inquire of God if their mission would be successful? We talked about this a bit. The question is, why do you think they asked him to inquire of God? Why did they think he could find out from God whether their mission would be successful? And when we look at the portion, Judges 1 to 18, 1 to 6, we know that, I'm sorry, yeah. The Danite spies recognized the Levite because they were taken aback when they saw him here. Some Bibles say they recognized the accent, but most of the versions I read said that they recognized his voice. To the extent they are surprised to find him in the singular, this person serving at Micah's place. They ask him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here? So this is someone they probably had encountered before and noticed. And they're surprised to find him in this place doing what he was doing. So there is a good knowledge. They could gradually take God out of themselves, but they could not forget some of the things that they knew. They knew the significance of a Levite, right? And when they see the ephod, when the Levite explains to them that Micah had set up the shrine and he probably showed them the ephod, or it was in plain view to be seen, they knew that the ephod was something through which they could uh, derive God's decisions, right? And so here was a very convenient position. They were in a convenient position. They had a malleable priest and a fake ephod. Put that together and they thought they could get God's real decision for them. So they said, why not? And all of this while, remember, this is happening in Micah's house, which is a few miles from Shiloh. They're not very far away from where the tabernacle is. So you're close to the tabernacle. So you really know that what you're doing is you are in violation of what you're trying to do. Yet there is a belief that perhaps you can figure out something here, because there seems to be all the outward symbols, all the outward things seem to be right, that you can divine God's purpose. And here is a priest who's willing to try it out for them. A lot like how Balaam was called on to curse the Israelites in Moab. So the Levite also, what we see is the Levite has no hesitation either. He has come this far, he's willing to go further. He's already violated a lot of what he was meant to be and what he was supposed to do. And he now is under pressure, right? He has to sustain this image. And he's under this pressure from these spies. They were capable men. They were strong men. They were chosen 5 men of the Dans. And they must have been pretty threatening because Dan was a little warlike tribe. And so he fakes an answer from God. He tells them what they want to hear. It is very unlikely that the Lord was in support of the spies' mission because they were going to search. Their mission itself was not favorable to God, right? And it is very unlikely that a fake God would answer through a fake ephod either. So it's a set of unlikely circumstances. But interesting to note is that the Danite spies have now seen this Levite and they have seen the ephod, and they have someone who tells them that God is speaking to them through the ephod. So this stays in their mind, and we'll see this playing out later. Okay. The next question is the report of the Danite spies. See, when they come back to their tribe, they report that they found this perfect place in Laish, right? It's very prosperous. The people are very unaware that they could be attacked. There is no defenses, strong defenses, nobody to defend them. Great place, right? It seems to tick off all the boxes for what they wanted. No strong opponents. A great place to stay. So they come back and they seem to have, on the face of it, to the Danites, it must have looked like they completed their mission excellently. They found a place that was everything they wanted, right? In terms of prosperity and in terms of lack of threat and the ease with which they could conquer. Yet, in the eyes of the author of Judges, the mission of their spies, their report and their call of action is not seen favorably, right? Why? Why do you think so? So the contrast, if we look at the spies, both Joshua and Caleb in Numbers, as well as the spies that go and spy out Jericho, where they meet Rahab and come back with a report, none of them came back to say that the task was simple. But in both cases, there was a question of who was mandating them to do this. And it was a challenge, all right, but what is the context of the challenge? With God on their side, was God already acting on their behalf, or would God act on their behalf? There is no mention of anything like that in sincerity here. Even if you look at the word that they used in verse 10, when you get there, you'll find an unsuspecting people and a spacious land that God has put into your hand. So note it's God, not the Lord, not Yahweh, a land that lacks nothing whatever. So some things are like they're trying to uh, pick on God as the source of identification of this land, and they even choose words, right? Uh, in their report, they choose words to see, uh, to make it mission is the same as the mission that Joshua had when they entered the promised land, right? Uh, in my Bible, in some Bibles, it says, God is handing over the land to you. And we saw how Joshua was told, look and see, I've already given this land into your hand. Whenever he asked him to step up to the challenge, right? To go and take over a certain city. So they are using familiar phrases, familiar imagery to lend authenticity to their call for action, right? The authenticity, they cannot depart from the fact that their authenticity comes from their godly mandate, and they're trying to lend some weight to that. We see how the Danites have become very lethargic. The spies are telling them, why are you so lazy? Get up, let's go and do this. This is an easy job. And the way the author describes the spies and the response of the Danites as well as the people of Laish clearly tells us the author is not seeing this as a good thing, because he clearly tells us that the people who stayed in Laish were unsuspecting, right? They were undisturbed and unsuspecting. They had no protectors. There is no mention of them being true. The Lord saw that as part of the Canaan promised land, and at some time, according to his plan, Israel would occupy that land also. But clearly, it was not the way the Danites had set out to do it, right? So, and so from a lot of this, we can infer that the author is not in favor of the mission of the spies, not in favor of their report, though the spies were trying to make it look like they were doing things that is similar to what happened to them historically when they entered and conquered the promised land.
Yeah. So just one point, bless you. Actually, just look at one phrase. It says there were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They are far from the Sidonians, and there are no ties with anyone. So they've identified the weakest among the weakest, the most
That
secure
is
people to attack.
that is true. That is true. And then they say, God is going to hand it over to you. Right? It's a contradiction
Exactly,
in.
exactly.
Yeah. So whenever we see the author emphasizing that these people are helpless, they were peaceful, they didn't have protectors, it is to tell us that he's not approving of this, right? So moving on to the next question. So we have one or two extra questions this time. So we'll discuss 5, 6 we will just go through, right? We won't discuss it. We'll just, if you have some comments, you can make, okay? So this is the last question before we go to a breakout question. So we are now in this phase where these Danites are setting out to go and conquer this lovely place, this nice and easy place where they could have a cushy life, right? This portion, however, the largest portion we're studying is loaded with irony, right? Micah steals, and with his stolen money, he makes gods, and his gods are stolen from him. The Levite is fake, and his sincerity is fake. The Danites see no problem with actually stealing from Micah, and they see no problem with threatening. There's it's so much of irony in this phase. Every in this portion, right? Uh, Danites are coveting what? They're coveting the God that their brethren have, right? They're coveting the priests. They're willing to steal the entire religion of their brethren, right? So throughout this portion, there in the beginning of chapter 17, the impact has widened, and the beginning of chapter 18, the impact of the fact that they recognize no king is widening, right? Each man was doing what he considered to be right. What are the widening impacts? If let's just discuss that quickly. So throughout this portion, what are the things that tell us that the impact of Micah's act was not restricted to Micah alone, it was widening. The impact of what the Levite did was widening. It was going to influence more than just him and Micah, right? So that's what I want to look at. So when you're doing something that is sinful, insincere, it is not restricted. It will be found out and it will grow. So it will find you out and it will grow. You cannot prevent it, right? It's not a one-time thing. It will grow. when you're living a lie. And it will expand. And when it expands, the boundary touches more than just you. It will touch your family, community. What is the evidence for that we see in this portion? That's a question to discuss.
Okay. So the question was, what are the widening impacts we can see in those days when Israel had no king and each man did what was right in his own eyes? We saw how Micah's mother sets him off on the path to idolatry. It starts with that, right? And we see how the idolatry spreads from Micah and his family to his neighbors. Because in verse 22, we see Micah's neighbors have joined him in trying to go and get back their gods and their priests from the Danites, right? Then throughout the temptation of Micah's idols and the fake ephod, through the temptation, right? Now, remember how the spies had seen these fake gods and the ephod and the priest who would tell them what they wanted to hear? So that becomes a source of temptation for the Danite tribe, right? So Micah's act of setting up this fake priest and the fake shrine and the idols leads the tribe of Dan, the spies first, and then the entire Danites who are setting out to fall into apostasy. Then Micah, we saw how he tempts the Levite to do wrong. And the Levite, in turn, is in a position where he is in the wrong, and he sees nothing wrong in deceiving the Danite tribe. And he's also part of now the Danites falling into this apostasy, right? So, and to add to that, we see how the Levite now that he has gone so far, he sees nothing wrong in even betraying his master Micah for personal gain. It's like he's told he's going to have a much larger congregation if he goes with them, rather than just one family and the immediate neighborhood. And he says, wow, this is great. I'm really growing and I'm growing fast. So he decides to abandon Micah. So we see how the apostasy, which starts from Micah's mother, spreads to Micah, then to Micah's neighbors, then to the Levite, then to his neighborhood, and then to the entire tribe of Dan. So sin cannot be contained, right? It spreads. The edges keep growing, and it is going to spread and get more and more people into its trap until it is put down and resisted. So that's what we can see from this portion. If you all move to your next question, which is, we'll directly discuss this question because it's short on time. It's the last 3 verses of this chapter, the establishment of the idolatry as official and public in Dan. Okay, to establish their city, the Danites took 3 things, right? They took the gods that Micah made, they took the priest that they could bribe, and they took a city, the inhabitants of the city, with the city where the inhabitants could not defend themselves. They were also the first tribe among the Israelites to establish idolatry as an official way of worship, public and official. It's in the open now. What are the short-term and the long-term impacts of their idolatry, right? So it's not directly there in this portion, but there are hints of that. When Dan did not take what God had granted them, but they seized what God had not given them, in the short term, they seem to have gained security and prosperity. Looks like what they decided to do for themselves was better than what God planned for them in the short term. But in the long term, as we read on in the rest of the chapters, we will see that this resulted in the tribe of Dan being lost to all. Okay? When you read First Chronicles where the tribes are listed, the tribe of Dan does not find a mention. Dan is only mentioned as a geographic marker, right? They renamed the city Laish as Dan, and they are only remembered as a geographical marker, not as a tribe any longer. And even in Revelation, when you get to Revelation in chapter 7, where before the tribulation, where the 12 tribes are listed out, we will see that the name of Dan is missing. So they seem to have been forgotten. Short-term security, short-term prosperity, but long-term, they have lost everything. They are lost forever, right? So all subsequent references to Dan are more geographical references than as a tribe. and they're missing in eternity. So that is the consequence of what Dan, and we will see later that Dan and what they did establishes apostasy in Israel. They become the source of apostasy spreading and idolatry officially spreading in Israel, right? And even like this portion mentions that they were among the first tribes to be carried away also, when the Assyrians actually invade and take over the northern part of Israel. Okay, so that covers the portion we want to study. And let's move into the question for our breakout session. So throughout these two chapters, we studied the importance of true worship. In 17th and 18th chapter, we see how self-styled worship, which was Micah's error, self-determined service, which was Jonathan, that is the Levite's error, and self-seeking security, which was the Danites' error. All of it resulted, when self was in the center, it results in false worship, right? So the question is, what is true worship? Jesus had something to say about this in John chapter 4, verse 23 and 24. So read what Jesus says is true worship. This is Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, right? And he describes what is true worship, a very important portion of scripture. So that is our question for our breakout session. What is true worship? What did Jesus have to say about it? Minnie will break us out into our discussion groups. I unfortunately will not be able to share this, but I think the question is simple enough. What is true worship? The reference is John chapter 4, 23 and 24 verses. What has Jesus got to say about it?
I was sharing just some thoughts that I found from this portion is one, in Greek, the spirit and truth are inseparable. In that phrase, they're like one idea with two components. So the spiritual realm of worship and the truth, that is Jesus, are inseparably bound in true worship. Then God is spirit, as against corporeal, that is having a physical existence. And so worship must be spiritual rather than material. And third, true worship transcends any particular time and place. True worship requires every aspect and part of our lives to be an expression of love and service to the Lord. These are three thoughts that I had pulled together before today's session. If anyone has anything to share that you discussed that if you feel the group would benefit, you can just speak out. So just a parting thought that I'd like to leave you with from today's this one. The Heart of Worship, Matt Redman's song, is something that's very familiar. And he says it beautifully when he talks about worship. I bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. And that's the heart of worship, right? A beautiful chorus to really explain the heart of true worship. Just wanted to leave you with that thought.